Welcome to the Real News Network, coming to you from our studio in Washington, D.C. This morning, Tim Geithner, who's the Secretary of the Treasurer for President Obama, made his rounds of the Sunday morning talk shows. Here's how he defended his plan to bail out or save the American banking system.
The investors, especially in the plans to buy up these toxic assets, are not taking all that much of a risk. They're going to put up $6 and they're going to get 93% from the government. We'll share on the upside, yes, but they're protected against huge losses.
Sure, let's just step back for a sec. The problem we're facing now in our financial system is that banks made a bunch of loans backed by real estate that are now facing losses. And those loans are clogging up the financial system. They're taking up room that could otherwise be used to provide new credits to a business or a family. Now, we have two choices. We can leave that as it is, hope that banks earn their way out of this over time. That would be a mistake. That would leave us with a deeper, longer recession. We're not prepared to adopt that basic strategy.
Well, there's a third choice.
There's another choice. Let me just say, there's another choice a lot of people suggest is the government itself comes in, buys these assets, sets the price of the asset, takes on all the risk in that strategy. Now, that would leave the taxpayer taking on much more risk, much greater risk of loss over time. We don't think that's an appropriate approach. The approach we're adopting, though, is to have private investors come in and put their capital at risk alongside the government. That helps make sure we're using their incentive to set the price for these assets, rather than having the government set the price and risk overpaying.
Now, joining us from Frankfurt, Germany, to unpack Mr. Geithner's comments is William Engdahl. He's an economist, author, and risk consultant for many financial institutions in Europe. His upcoming book is Power of Money, The Rise and Fall of the American Century, which will be available this summer. Thanks for joining us, William.
Thank you.
So we don't want to sustain the weak and thus weaken the strong. So what do you make of Mr. Geithner's plan?
Well, the Geithner's public-private partnership is really to give the private sector, hedge funds and other investors, a windfall of profits at the expense of the public taxpayer. And there are all sorts of tricks, if you read the fine print of the plan, to disguise what's really going on. For example, the Federal Deposit Insurance Company is listed in the plan as the major conduit for lending to hedge funds to make this investment and buy these toxic assets off the books of the banks. Well, this is, the FDIC is virtually bankrupt. They've bailed out so many large banks in the last 18 months. They don't have the capital to do this. So what are they talking about? They're talking about the U.S. Treasury, which is the U.S. government, as the nominal owner of the FDIC. And little tricks like these are simply, and the reason Geithner had such a difficult time in finally coming up with this package was to hide that reality. He's hiding the fact that he's bailing out Wall Street. These are not American banks. These are essentially, and this is really the crucial crux of the entire matter. There are 5 institutions in the United States of America, according to the latest released report of the Office of Comptroller of the Currency, the U.S. government, 5 institutions, supposed banks: Goldman Sachs, Citigroup, Citibank, J.P. Morgan Chase, and Bank of America, and one other institution, and they hold 90 to 95% of the instruments that are at risk, that are putting the entire global financial system at risk. The credit default swaps, the various other derivatives that are so explosive and adding to these losses like AIG. So when Geithner makes these verbal sophistic remarks about we don't want to make make the weak banks stronger and strong banks weaker, he's just playing games with the public.
Well, he in the interview with Stephanopoulos, he acknowledges that it's a bailout. His fundamental argument, which he's made here and he makes in other places, is that the alternative is worse. That American people should live with even high compensation for bank presidents and corporate leaders. They should live with the fact that Wall Street might make some profit out of this, because without this, the system collapses, and that's worse for everybody.
Well, there are 2 systems. There's a normal banking system where most banks in the United States are fairly soberly run and conservatively run. They may have some excesses and bad real estate loans and so forth, but for the most part, they're healthy banks. they are impaired from lending to normal commercial and industrial and consumers because of the overall jam up in the banking system caused at the top of the pyramid. The top of the pyramid is where the problem lies, and what Geithner doesn't say in this plan, well, he does say, he says we don't go down that road, is these 5 or 6 institutions should be put into immediate government receivership. The management should be eradicated, fired immediately. The toxic assets be booked by the government in these government-owned institutions in receivership, booked down to zero net worth, and perhaps in 4 or 5 years when they're sold off in a healthier climate, they'll bring net positive returns from zero. But right now they have to be booked at zero in order to get out of this mess. We have to break the logjam of the credit system. What you're doing with the Geithner plan is essentially what I call throwing fertilizer on a dead tree. These banks are brain-dead banks, Citigroup, Bank of America, etc. JP Morgan Chase looks better simply because they have the action on the creation of credit default swaps, and they're doing quite lovely, thank you, by the terms of the previous bailouts of Paulson and company. So this is the heart of the problem. This is what has to be addressed.
Well, he's making his argument is that by allowing this private-public partnership, it will use sort of the market wisdom, market mechanism to give some value to these assets, and that without that, the government doesn't know what they're worth. And then the second thing he says that he's found the balance between too much benefit for the banks and too much benefit for the private investors.
Yeah, and we're supposed to trust him.
That's more or less the message.
I don't. I've examined Tim Geithner's career when he was president of the New York Federal Reserve, and that's not a basis for me to trust someone to manage this crisis. He caused a good part of this crisis. He was in on the decision with Paulson and company to let Lehman Brothers go belly up back in September, and that took a contained crisis and made it into a global systemic crisis and mushroomed the losses into the trillions of dollars worldwide. And now it's much, much more difficult to deal with this. This is Geithner's track record. This man is incompetent to be Treasury Secretary. He is representing the interests of the Wall Street money oligarchy.
In his interview with Stephanopoulos, he talks about how he never worked directly for Wall Street. He was always on the public interest government side of this.
Yes. What is the New York Federal Reserve? It's a private bank. And the shareholders of that private bank, the board of directors, are names like JP Morgan Chase, AIG used to be on the board, and it's a privately owned institution. He's not a public servant in that sense. And before that, he had other such experience. He was with the Treasury, of course. But there's a blur between this particular public interest and the private sector of this money oligarchy. You know, in Russia, we used to talk in the 90s about the Russian financial oligarchy looting and plundering the country. And if you think about it, that's pretty much what you've got in the United States today. Since Larry Summers in 1999 and 2000 as Treasury Secretary under the Clinton administration, he oversaw the repeal of Glass-Steagall, which freed up banks, insurance companies, and investment banks, Wall Street banks like Goldman Sachs, to merge and combine and create these mammoth institutions, $2 trillion, $2.2 trillion of assets in Citibank, Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase is slightly less. And these mammoth institutions are so awesomely big that the Congress is terrified of doing anything to get on their wrong side.
They've come up with this great phrase called they're too big to fail.
Yeah, they're too big to fail. My answer to that is they're too big to save, and they should be put into receivership. The FDIC has standard rules for this when a bank is in trouble. Put them into receivership, break it up into 20 or 30 smaller banks instead of this Goliath that's called Citigroup, and then take the toxic assets off of the market, price it at zero, and if maybe in 5 years they begin to have some value, if some of these mortgages recover because the economy is recovering and people get jobs again, then you can talk about selling those assets and paying back some of that tax. Well,
Geithner's explanation of all this is all of that may be true in terms of the working with Wall Street and not taking them on, and so on and so on. But he says the only real test or objective here is liquidity going to come back into the system or not? Are small businesses and people going to get loans? So is it possible this plan will work even if Wall Street makes a lot of money along the way?
No, I don't see it, because first of all, the debts, it's a Band-Aid measure, which he's not really being open about. It's a Band-Aid measure to staunch a hemorrhage of losses that these 4 or 5 big institutions are having. Those losses are going to exponentially increase over the next 2-3 years as the mortgage losses, the loan losses that those banks have made explode into a deepening recession, depression. I call it a depression. It soon will be acknowledged to be that. And this thing is going to be worse than the 1930s, the way things are going, because they refused, the Obama administration, Geithner, as well as the Bush administration, refused to touch the inner sanctum of the Holy of Holies called Wall Street and the money oligarchy. And until you do that, I don't like to use terms like money oligarchy to refer to American banks, but that is literally, if you look up the dictionary definition of oligarchy, it's money defining the political control, and that's what we have developed into in the U.S. banking system over the last 15 to 20 years. And that's what has to be cleaned up. That's what Geithner is not going to touch with a 10-foot pole, because he knows that's taboo.
Thanks very much for joining us, William.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network. And don't forget our donate button, because we don't have any oligarchs supporting us. So we need you to click donate. Real News Network.